Hello and welcome to today's video. In today's video, I want to talk to you about the topic of cybersecurity and what you should actually know about it. Many people think it's enough to just install antivirus software, use a password manager, and then that's all there is to it. But that's not enough, especially not for companies who then think they don't have to worry about anything anymore. Because, for example, they trust Bitdefender or Kaspersky, and unfortunately, that's the fatal misconception that you can completely rely on antivirus protection and, let's say, just switch off your own brain and trust that the antivirus will block everything. Of course, these programs are good and have their place, as I've mentioned in several videos before. I'm also not someone who says it's just snake oil. But the fact is, of course, that this antivirus software simply can't detect everything. Many antivirus scanners, even with artificial intelligence, can't detect the latest potential viruses and malware. And that also applies to Windows Defender. And here, it's simply important that you keep educating yourself regularly, that you regularly train your employees so that employees can recognize, okay, this could actually be a phishing email, how to actually recognize if it's malware, to simply develop an eye for it, to notice when something seems suspicious, when certain parts just don't sound right, or when it sounds too good to be true, so that you know exactly what matters, so you can see whether it's a phishing email or a real internal email, whether it's from an employee or if the email is coming from outside. There are various ways to recognize this, including looking at the sender at fake logos, like when PayPal is spelled with two L's, for example, but also at suspicious demands, whether it's requests for donations or dubious promises of winnings, though the latter probably concerns companies less. But whenever there is immediate pressure to act, like you must update your bank details now, or you must update your password now, you must now click on this attachment because it contains a very important application or something else that your company absolutely needs. And of course, there are also these promises, these are usually Trojans, that promise you a fantastic product that will let you work much more efficiently and productively. Here is the link to it, or you'll find the file in the attachment to download the program. Unfortunately, many employees still fall for this, hard to believe. Not just in Germany, but worldwide. There are still a great many cyber attacks, especially when it comes to Trojans and ransomware. Ransomware has been an issue since 2017 and since WannaCry, which affected a huge number of PCs worldwide. And what was the problem? The problem was that many companies, many businesses, freelancers, and even a lot of private individuals were still using Windows 7, and at that time, Windows XP was no longer getting any major support. By 2017, Windows 10 was already out. There was already talk of launching Windows 11, and that didn't come much later either. But Windows 10 was definitely current at the time, and not all companies had it yet. Many branch offices didn't have it, and many were still using older versions of Windows. They didn't install the updates, didn't do any upgrades, used older browsers like Internet Explorer, and then had to realize, okay, we're affected because we didn't update this laptop, because we didn't act in time, didn't install the latest updates, and Microsoft actually only released an update for Windows 7 and Windows XP. You have to imagine that at that time in 2017, numerous computers were still running Windows XP. That's no longer the case, but back then that's how it was. But now it's actually the same with Windows 10 as it was back then with Windows 7 and Windows XP. Many people simply don't want to make this downgrade or can't for financial reasons, or maybe just because they really like Windows 10 and say, why is there no more support for it? We insist on it. By the way, Microsoft was actually sued over this and has now, I believe, extended support for another year so people can have more time to consider switching to Windows 11. And yes, I think it's good that these companies and also private individuals now have more time to carry out this upgrade. If they want to stick with Windows 10 for now, then that's okay. And not everyone wants to switch to Linux, but that's only one part of what makes up cybersecurity. There are so many other important things that also fall under this topic. For example, that you also keep the topic of GDPR and data protection in mind. This probably concerns the European region more, especially the UK and Ireland. That you actually know what makes a GDPR compliant website, that you use cookie banners, for example, Matomo instead of Google Analytics, and all these things. This is less relevant for the USA. But even here, of course, more and more people are considering what is actually important when it comes to data protection. What should I pay attention to? Which browser makes sense? Many people, for example, are already using Brave. Brave is quite good. Vivaldi and also Firefox are still being used. Of course, Google Chrome is the front runner and Microsoft Edge as well. But even Microsoft Edge is now placing more emphasis on data protection. So now, of course, I don't want to exaggerate here, but there are these privacy settings in Microsoft Edge, and these privacy settings also exist in Google, somewhat hidden, but they definitely exist. And the new AI browsers just aren't as good because they collect a lot of data about us, know a lot about us, and of course, we also enter a lot of information about ourselves. With companies, it might be less of a problem or happens less frequently, I'd say. Of course, company data is also valuable, no question about it. But I mean more in the private sphere where people simply trust the AI search engines and CHP with too much information. Here, data protection obviously plays a major role, and in general, it's important to make sure you're using a secure browser. What do I mean by secure? I just mentioned it a moment ago. I'm a big fan of Microsoft Edge when it comes to security because it works seamlessly with Windows Defender. But the Google browser, meaning Chrome, is also very good with its sandbox model. It's one of the best browsers you can use and also one of the most secure. Firefox isn't quite as optimal, and Opera even less so because they don't release updates regularly, but usually with a delay. Nevertheless, the major browser manufacturers are generally the better choice. Because even now, many people still use these small Firefox derivatives. I don't even know all of them. I happen to know Waterfox, and I think one is called Hallmoon. That's always a bit critical, and it was the same back then with Internet Explorer. That's definitely something you should keep in mind. And then, of course, there's also the topic of search engines. I've already mentioned this in my recent videos. There are very good alternatives to Google, for example, Startpage. DuckDuckGo is a very good search engine, and of course there are other search engines like Quant. There are numerous smaller ones as well. Viscos, for example, is among them. They're based in Switzerland. And of course, there's also Bing's search engine, which is probably used by more people who also use the Microsoft Edge browser. And in some cases, you can actually get better search results for research there. So it's definitely worth taking a look and comparing your research results with those from Google, especially now with the new search engine that Google is launching, the new AI-powered search engine. Everyone should really think about this, and of course this also affects businesses since traffic is likely to drop here. Many large magazines, blogs, and news portals will lose traffic due to AI-generated answers. That's simply a fact. So what else do we have on the topic of cybersecurity? I wrote a blog article today about Windows Defender and OneDrive. Most companies, of course, work with Microsoft 365, so OneDrive and Windows Defender are very good. Windows Defender for Business and OneDrive for Business. The premium or elite versions in this case, but you can also get by quite well with the regular Windows Defender. Of course, it also depends on the business. If someone is a freelancer or self-employed, then it's okay. But for medium-sized and larger companies, it's definitely recommended to use the enterprise version. And here you really do have more configuration options in Windows Defender and of course also more settings in Microsoft OneDrive. It's also important to generally mention the topic of cloud security and creating backups. And you should always create a backup and secure your data. From my point of view, the best approach is to store your data on multiple storage devices, meaning hard drive, USB stick, and cloud, to be on the safe side. It actually happened to me personally that I had a very valuable USB stick with important documents and data on it, and unfortunately it burned out. And I didn't have a copy or anything from that USB stick, so I swore to myself, never again. I burned CDs, I burned DVDs, this hybrid storage approach. Well, CDs and DVDs aren't exactly cutting edge anymore. There are Blu-rays now, which would be an option. Really good hard drives with several terabytes of storage, and of course the cloud as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be Microsoft's cloud. There are also other very good providers, for example, Google and Dropbox. I've also worked with others using Dropbox. Of course, the approach there is more about collaborating with colleagues and teams. With Microsoft OneDrive, it's really more about security itself and also the automatic backup strategy. And again, it's just the case that Microsoft OneDrive works seamlessly with everything. So with Windows Defender, with Microsoft Edge, Internet Explorer, of course with the Edge browser, and with PowerPoint, with Excel, which you can also use here on your laptop. All of this is really worthwhile for companies that have multiple computers, since they can use it across several devices. So another important point is, of course, the topic of passwords. And I was really shocked by a documentary about this involving politicians, companies again, but also private individuals, really you could say from all walks of life, that people are still using passwords like our company, my summer 2015, my darling, my house. And passwords like these are an absolute no-go, or 12345, which is also a very popular password. It's still hard to believe, even though there are now such good password managers like Keeper and NordPass, which have top ratings and really offer excellent features. They also, of course, offer an enterprise version. For multiple teams, for larger teams, the price becomes correspondingly cheaper. And here it's really the case that you remember one master password, a really strong master password. And that's the only password you actually need. And then you can log in with this password and have access to all the other passwords. And then it's not that it doesn't matter, but you can have these passwords generated automatically and then access them. There are really excellent password managers. I've already mentioned a few, and I would definitely recommend every company to use these password managers rather than writing passwords down on a piece of paper and, in the worst case, sticking it to the monitor where everyone can see it. And it's also important, in my opinion, not to share your Wi-Fi password with just anyone. So really only give access to employees, only to people you trust, so that the Wi-Fi password is set securely, not everyone knows it, and it's simply safe. At this point, I also want to mention the firewall, which is also very good in Windows Defender and can provide a certain level of protection against hackers and intruders. That's definitely a pretty good thing, but now I've strayed too far from the topic of passwords. So it's really important that you set a good Wi-Fi password and also change this Wi-Fi password, because by default it comes from Telecom and you should definitely change that. And when it comes to Wi-Fi security, it's of course also important to know who is in the respective network, who has access to the cloud, who has access to all the Microsoft services, and to whom you are granting access. And of course you should also be aware of that. I don't even mean out of malicious intent, but sometimes it's simply the case that employees aren't careful, click on some links, or unfortunately sometimes even have malicious intentions and take advantage of that trust. That's why it's important to restrict this access and only grant it to certain people. That also has to do with secure internal networks, not just external ones, because most people always think a hacker comes along, then there's a phishing email, and that's how the virus or malware ends up on the laptop. Yes. When it comes to cybersecurity, you should also know that it can, of course, happen, and it doesn't even have to be an employee. It could really be someone from outside pretending to be someone else who wants to have something printed. And then, well, companies don't really do it the way they used to, but it did happen that someone would hand over a USB stick or a CD and you could print something from it. Here in Germany, it's now the case that in all these internet cafes, but also in government offices, it's absolutely unwanted and forbidden to submit any USB sticks or CDs and then ask for something to be printed. That pretty much doesn't happen anymore. So only privately, basically in a home office setting, precisely for this reason, because it's relatively easy to infect a USB stick with a Trojan, and a CD can also quite easily transfer a virus or malware to the computer. Yes, that's definitely something you should know about cybersecurity, and honestly, there's not much more to say about the basics for now. I will go into more detail on certain areas, but for now, this was just an overview of what's important to know about cybersecurity, and the main thing is that most attacks actually happen via email, specifically through phishing emails. Of course, nowadays these are also generated by AI, and many attacks also take place via the dark web, the darknet itself. When people move around there or click on the wrong links, and the method I just mentioned would be the offline method, where USB sticks or other data carriers are infected and then go on to infect the laptop. Thank you very much for listening, and see you in the next video.